Cletonian mobsters, a Mandalorian duel, a giant womp rat and a 10-second starfighter. Let's take a look at the Book of Boba Fett Chapter 5. Roll intro. Hi and welcome back to my channel. I'm Joel and definitely exceedingly excited to talk about the Book of Boba Fett Chapter 5. This format is Devaronian in the details, so as you can probably guess, there will be spoilers. Also, I didn't break down any episode of Star Wars live action yet, but with this episode, I just had to. So no tiptoeing around the womp rat, let's get into it. We start off with these Cletonians cutting up meat, and the cadavers hanging from the ceiling look like cows to me, which is confirmed by the cow-like heads we see in the concept art at the end instead. Then we see a silhouette of a Mandalorian appear behind the plastic flaps of the door, but this isn't Boba, it's Mando. Mando has dealt with Cletonians before in Chapter 4 Sanctuary of his own show when he protected the village from Cletonian raiders. The office in a butchery with a plaster and some kind of credits on the table gives off a mafia vibe. Mando is looking for a bounty, and he has a holo of his target, Kaba buys, which says wanted, and a sum that looks to be in the 8 or 9 thousands. Kaba says that that's not him and doesn't even look like him, subtly accusing Mando of racism. Mando's ways haven't changed, and he says,
I can bring you in warm, or I can bring you in cold.
Just like in the very first episode of The Mandalorian, telling us that these kinds of situations are a bit of a never-ending story for him. The first Cletonian attacking bites him, which fits nicely with their dog-like appearance. Mando opts for his blaster first, but since he loses that to the bite, he now goes for the Darksaber instead. But he mostly uses fists and elbows to attack anyway, showing reluctance to use the Darksaber, and he handles it poorly, which leads to him cutting his own leg. The crude way he uses the lightsaber clearly distinguishes him from the Jedi, who try to never cut through whole bodies when they can help it, and also try not to cut limbs off if possible. This, by the way, is also important when Anakin cuts off Count Dooku's hands, because he's so powerful but only reluctantly cuts off his head. Mace Windu's decapitation of Jango Fett shows how closely he comes to the dark side with his use of the Warped lightsaber form, and Obi-Wan also seems to not have gotten the no chopping off limbs memo. But back to Mando, who is just not proficient with the lightsaber and also doesn't really care that much about chopping people up, I guess, which is probably fueled with anger through pain as well, after he accidentally cuts himself. After collecting his target's head, Mando faces the workers and cleverly distracts them with the credits of their boss by insinuating that they deserve them, but leaving the choice to them. By the way, I also really love how different some of the Cletonians look. Next, we see the logo of the show and the title of the episode, Chapter 5, Return of the Mandalorian. Not that much of a surprise by this point, but certainly a welcome one, and of course the music is a mix between the Book of Boba Fett and the Mandalorian intro music. Then there's what I think is an entirely new place, and I assume I wasn't the only one who was reminded of Interstellar, but also Halo, of course. I also thought of the Ring of Kafrene. Both places are kind of weirdly in space without being a planet, and honestly, Ring of Kafrene would make a better name for this place than for what it actually is. There's also a little bit of Inception as well as 2001: A Space Odyssey. Mando limps through the city and takes an elevator with this interesting alien. I'm not sure if we know the species already, but they reminded me of Sketch, a companion of the bounty hunter in Star Wars: The Old Republic. So could it be a female of the Hogue species? Mando enters a cantina where he finds his current employers. The person speaking is of the Ishi tip species. There's also a Quarren as well as what I believe to be a female Devaronian. I am not quite sure about the other species. They want him to sit with them and give him another job, but he refuses and forces them to give him directions by threatening to collect a bounty somewhere else. They are probably not too amused about it, so we could see them again. When Mando takes the elevator next, it's a nice continuous shot, which reminds me of Dynamo Dream, a short film made by the YouTuber Ian Hubert, completely in Blender. The free 3D software are also used for my intro. This is not an ad, by the way, the short film is just really exceptional and you should watch it after this. Mando walks through some industrial looking streets until he finds signs leading him to the hidden covert of his Mandalorian tribe. I first thought the signs were Mandoa, but if I'm not mistaken they are just an icon of the Mandalorian helmets. Mando enters the covert and is now below the city, which simultaneously means on the outside of the ring, which is reminiscent of the underbelly of Cloud City or the Senate on Coruscant, where Luke and Yoda are picked up in Return of the Jedi and Revenge of the Sith. And there she is, the Armorer, sitting there just as she did in The Mandalorian before she messed up those stormtroopers. She orders Paz Vizsla, the only other survivor, to care for Mando's wounds, and he applies a spray, probably Bacta spray. She asks Mando about the weapon that caused the wound, and he shows her the Darksaber, and they discuss that the one who wields it cannot just lead all of Mandalore if he's won the blade in battle, but also curse the nation if he came by it in another way. Next, Mando and Paz Vizsla set up the Beskar Forge again, and Mando tells them how he got the Darksaber off Moff Gideon, but didn't kill him in the process. The Armorer says that it was foretold that the Mythosaur would rise to herald a new age for Mandalore, but that it doesn't really exist. However, when Boba got his Rancor, he said that he rode a creature 10 times its size, which probably referenced the Mythosaur he rode in his very first appearance in the Star Wars Christmas special. It might have been mostly a reference, but it did the next best thing to canonizing the existence of an actual Mythosaur, so this could very well come into play later. The Armorer explains that Mandalorian Beskar is not meant for weapons, so Mando gives up the Beskar spear so she can forge armor from it. He asks about Bo-Katan, and the Armorer tells him that she ruled Mandalore without having won the sword in battle, and hence it ended in tragedy, and the planet, or at least the surface, was destroyed by the Empire in the Night of 1,000 Tears. In a flashback we see bombers wreaking havoc on the surface of Mandalore, and KX and Viper probe droids looking through the ruins, making sure everyone's dead. The Armorer explains that only those who followed the way escaped and survived. Now Mando can decide what should be forged from the Beskar of the spear, and he wants something for Grogu since he is still a foundling. We see that she makes something rather small, consisting at least in part of rings, so since it's supposed to be armor, might it be a little Beskar chainmail? Although I have trouble picturing Grogu with it, honestly. Also, chainmail doesn't seem to be very Star Warsy in general, but we will see. Notice that the cloth she wraps it in has the shape of Grogu's head. Then Mando and the Armorer do a sparring fight, probably to test his skills with a Darksaber. He finds the blade heavy, but she tells him that's because he fights against the blade, not his enemy. That is understandable though, since he wounded himself with it before. This move she makes here reminds me of Chinese martial art movies, where the old master easily defeats the student with his cane or something, and similarly of Chirrut Imwe using his staff against the stormtroopers. Paz Vizsla has watched the fight and challenges Mando to a duel to win the Darksaber back for his house, the founder of which forged it and was a Mandalorian and a Jedi at the same time. Mando accepts, they take off their jetpacks and draw their weapons. Mando the Darksaber and Vizsla a vibro knife, as well as a small shield generator that works like a buckler. These were used on Mandalore during the Clone Wars as well. Mando disarms Vizsla, then the other way around. The blade actually seems to be really heavy, which implicates that Jedi have to deal with this as well, but still make it look effortless. It also fits George Lucas' original vision of the sabers, which were supposed to be really heavy, which is why Obi-Wan and Vader's duel in Episode 4 is so slow, because they both exclusively fight with both hands. The apparent weight and the armorer's comment that he fights against it could also mean that the way the blade was crafted has something to do with it. Maybe the energy field that keeps the blade's plasma in place is unusually strong and the wielder has to get used to that. Vizsla takes the Darksaber and Mando has to dodge his attacks but grabs the vibroblade and defeats Vizsla with newfound swiftness. To conclude the duel, the armorer confirms whether any of them has ever removed their helmet, and Mando has to confess that he did. They now consider him not to be a Mandalorian anymore, and he can only redeem himself in the living waters beneath the mines of Mandalore, a place that was most likely destroyed. But this pretty clearly sets up a reason for Mando to return to his home planet in the future, even more so after he just confirmed his claim to the Darksaber once again. I guess it's lucky that he got the gift for Grogu before he told them, because otherwise the armorer probably wouldn't have made it at all. Mando leaves and goes on his way to basically take a bus to Tatooine, the same kind the Pikes arrived in an earlier episode. I myself take the bus to work and back all the time, and man, it must suck even more for a bounty hunter. No wonder he only took the head of the Klatooinian instead of freezing him in carbonite like before. Imagine the premium for that checked baggage. Other passengers boarding before him include a Nikto as well as this lovely Snivian woman. Mando is supposed to surrender all his weapons and tries to play the religion card, and I guess this would have worked for the Jedi during the Republic era, but the droid, again a version of the droid in Star Tours in Disneyland and the one we saw dealing cards in an earlier episode, clearly has experience in dealing with space Karens and offers to get their supervisor, but that would delay Mando to a flight on the following day, so he gives in. The Western music playing while he puts his weapons in the case underlines the connection to classic scenes where people pull out more and more weapons for comedic effect, a staple of Western and pirate movies.
I know everything that's in there.
Proceed.
He even surrenders the cable that he can shoot from his wrist and reluctantly the Darksaber, but interestingly not his jetpack, although I think that's as much of a weapon as the cable. Not that Mando would need any weapon necessarily. He also gets a card for his stuff as if he handed over his coat in a club. Sorry for the little pandemic reality check, but remember when there were clubs and you could just go to them? Good times. On board, Mando looks longingly to the stars, while a little Rodian child watches him in awe from the row in front and waves. A lovely scene many people can relate to, I think, but this little green child of another species only reminds poor Mando of his own faraway foster child, and he gets his present out and looks at it. Then he arrives on Tatooine and gets his weapons back. I was half expecting that something would be missing because the fact that he had to give them up seemed like a Chekhov's gun situation to me. If you don't know what Chekhov's gun is, here's the short of it. It's a rule for writing stories that basically says that every element or item that appears in the story must have a function. So if there's a gun hanging on the wall in a scene, it must be used sooner or later or otherwise should be removed from the story. So when he had to give up his weapons and warned the droid that he knew everything in the box, I first expected something to be actually missing on arrival to give the scene its function. But that was before I realized that it was probably just to have the classic scene of someone drawing a ton of weapons, like I mentioned. Next, we see a BD droid, and I liked, even loved the episode until now, but for more than one reason I must say, This is where the fun begins. A pretty big womp rat grabs the BD unit and runs off with it. This is the BD droid's live-action debut after they got introduced in Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order with BD-1, Cal Kestis droid. We are in Peli Motto's yard and she runs after the womp rat with her blaster rifle, trying to kill it while her droids reluctantly follow. They refuse to help her because they are afraid, so she has to go in herself. The scene is a play on classic horror movies when the womp rat suddenly pulls her behind a cargo box and we watch from the droid's perspective while she gets dragged more and more behind the box. We don't see much of the womp rat itself, the same way the original cut of episode 5 didn't show much of the Wampa attacking Luke in the beginning. Another horror trope, since people's imagination creates worse monsters than most creature designers would. The womp rat looked to be maybe the size of a dog, but in the concept art at the end it looks huge. But that's a perspective trick because we watch from a very low angle, even lower than the head of one of those pit droids, so dog size actually fits well. Anyway, in comes Mando and shoots the womp rat. Peli Motto, however, is back up quickly and makes sure BD is okay. Generally, I must say I like the character Peli Motto from the beginning, but this episode makes her even more of a gem. So, of course, she orders the droid to grill the womp rat immediately, as they did with the Great Dragon meat before. She then goes on to show Mando a ship she found for him, but not before asking about Grogu, suggesting Mando should have opened a petting zoo with him, a sentiment probably most of us agree with. They go to the ship, which is still covered with blankets, and at first I thought it was a Bell Bullop 22 starfighter, the same model as General Grievous' starfighter, the soulless one. But of course it turned out to be a different prequel-era ship, namely an N1 starfighter, which were these yellow ships from Naboo used against the ships of the Trade Federation. By the way, this is not the first time they show up in new Star Wars lately. One of them is also in the trailer for Star Wars Eclipse, which I broke down in my first Devaronian in the details. Click in the top right corner to watch that. Mando, however, is not impressed, and I must admit I wasn't either in the beginning, but thank Farrick if Motto didn't convince both of us by the end of the episode. But first she offers him his money back, which gives her time to pitch the new ride to him. My first association was the Toyota Supra that they turned into a 10-second car in the first Fast and the Furious movie, and sure enough, that's basically what they do, and I'm absolutely here for it. So she hands him a wrench, and what follows is a montage of the repairs comprised of little scenes. We learn that the parts mostly come from Javas, who are pretty clearly just stealing them according to Peli Motto's list, as if they were doing the car export missions in GTA San Andreas, and who can blame them? I love those missions. Also, Peli Motto dated a Java and describes the experience as quite furry, very furry, lot of issues, which sounds interesting. She also speaks Java'ese, which is way too adorable. They send off most of the yellow color from the starfighter. We see the pit droids basically flip each other off out of jealousy, and Mando and Motto talk a lot of tech gibberish.
The entire vapor manifold is missing.
Trust me, the last thing you want strangling your thrust capacitor is a vapor manifold. I fabricated you this induction intake charger that's going to double your output coefficient.
It'll also blow the shaft out of my motivator block.
That's why I'm reinforcing your compression housing, and you can access it by using this kinesio switch right here. You hit this button, you're going to evacuate your exhaust manifold, if you know what I mean.
We see that the N1 has the same Naboo lettering on the side we saw on Anakin's starfighter, and the cockpit is very similar as well. BD shows Mando where one of the panels goes, and I had major Fallen Order flashbacks in the best way, and honestly suspected that BD, who was newly introduced this episode, would become a replacement for an astromech for the ship, since Mando warmed up to droids a little. He could use someone at least as long as Grogu isn't with him, and there's hardly a main character in Star Wars stories that didn't have a droid companion in some capacity. I guess it could still happen, but at least not in this episode. By the way, I guess this is not everyone's cup of tea, but man, I could listen to Peli Motto babbling about all day. I just love how she interacts with her droids and Mando and everything. She's just great. There's one interesting detail when the Yavas explain how they got the cryogenic density combustion booster, the same part Han used in episode 4 to stop the trash compactor, from a Pike Spice Runner when they were refueling. This brings us a little bit back to the fact that we are actually watching the Book of Boba Fett and not the Mandalorian, and also sounds like another Fast and Furious reference to me, where they stole stuff off moving vehicles a couple of times in the series. And when the droids bring the ship out, it definitely looks like a muscle car with the motor sticking out of the hood and everything, but really lightweight at the same time, or
not a gram of fat on her.
She has also removed the droid port, which are 5 apparently comments with some foul language, and there's now a seat for someone small, potentially with green pointy ears? As we see the finished ship with only hints of yellow left and otherwise somewhat matching Mando's armor, I thought, imagine he would collect so much Beskar that he could cover the whole ship. It would hardly need a shield generator anymore. That would be sick. When Mando tries to start her up for the first time, they use the same sound as the failing hyperdrive of the Millennium Falcon. But then she gets going and the hull creaks under the strain the engine puts on it. Mando thinks so too and comments,
"That's a lot of engine for a little ship."
How much? We'll see in a moment. As Mando gets airborne, he cautiously opens the throttle, but cheered on by Peli Motto, he opens her up completely and she speeds off like a true pod racer. And appropriately, he flies her through Beggar's Canyon, which was part of the pod racing track of the Bunta Eve race in episode 1. He pulls up and flies straight to space, where the little Rodian girl spots him again from a transport he flies by. And of course he has to try spinning, because if you know anything, then you know spinning is a good trick. Hell, even Kylo does it. But of course the cops are already waiting, so to speak, and he runs into 2 X-Wings of the New Republic who do the space equivalent of pulling him over. As we see a new pilot in one of them, I immediately expected a cameo of some sort, and it is in a way, because this is the stand-in actor they used for Luke in The Mandalorian, Max Lloyd Jones. He notes that the N1's engine model doesn't match the power drive, which makes sense since they custom built the ship from scratch, but it also sounds familiar to people repairing stuff like consoles in the real world and have to deal with the lack of a right to repair, which sometimes prevents them from changing the disk drives or other parts from consoles because the serial numbers don't match, so it doesn't work. Shout out to Steve from Tronics Fix here on YouTube. I love to watch his repair videos and I'm sure he'd love to get his hands on an N1 starfighter. Mando tells them that the ship is brand new and he just made a test run and will get everything in order right away, but the pilot wants him to surrender the controls for remote access instead. However, the other pilot chimes in to just let him off with a warning, making it a classic case of an eager young officer being pacified by his superior about a little traffic violation where nobody got hurt. Mando says, "Thank you, officer. I'll have that taken care of," which is very similar to what he said to the New Republic pilots when they stopped him in the Razor Crest in The Mandalorian. And now we see that the other pilot is not a new face, but actually Captain Carson Teva, who was one of those exact pilots who stopped him before, which is why he recognizes Mando's voice. He asks whether Mando by chance flew a Razor Crest before, because one was mentioned in connection to Imperial remnants on Navarro. So Mando doesn't have much of a choice anymore and speeds off, and the younger officer hilariously thinks he jumps to hyperspace before being informed that those were just the sublight thrusters. So there's a muscle car for you. And we also learn that the Republic officers do not seem to be great fans of paperwork, probably just like most of their real-life counterparts, so they let it slide. As Mando lands, there's another prequel callback when Motto asks how it was and Mando simply says, "Wizard." That's what Anakin's friend Kidster says when Anakin enters the pod race in episode 1, so it absolutely makes sense there and it's guaranteed to be a new fan favorite now. I guess it's somewhere between great and crazy. As the episode closes out, Fennec Shand seeks Mando out and tries to hire him as muscle, which he accepts and even refuses to take payment, which shows his respect for Boba Fett. However, he says that he has to visit a little friend before, just as Luke said to R2 in Return of the Jedi about Yoda when he left Tatooine. So I think we can safely assume that little friend to be Grogu, so now the question is, will we see that next episode, or are we going back to Boba Fett's point of view? But if Mando shows up there and helps Boba, would that mean that we don't see the meeting? I can't imagine that, so it has to take place next episode, or in a flashback when The Mandalorian starts its 3rd season, but that seems unlikely as well. So my money is on the next episode. A last little detail from the artworks in the credits is that the little girl on the transport wasn't supposed to be a Rodian originally, but properly a human. So, that was the episode, and I must say, I just loved it. This episode had so much cool stuff. I like the Boba Fett story as well, specifically the flashbacks, but I also see the same problems others have pointed out, although I still see a lot of potential for the show. But this Mandalorian episode, cause let's be real, that's what it is, just shows how good this stuff can be. I think the Klatooinians and their whole scene was well made. As ever, I enjoyed everything with the armorer, the Mandalorian history lessons, the duel, then the little tearjerker on the transport, and finally everything on Tatooine. There's something about having the frame of a car, or in this case a starfighter, sit somewhere, a few parts hanging out, most of the important stuff missing, and then watching it get fixed up that just resonates with me and I guess many others as well. The sound when he finally starts the N1 up, just perfect. I never liked the ships too much, despite liking episode 1, but the yellow just made them look too plasticky for me. But this is perfect. I still don't know how he will transport future bounties though. That's like a real-life bounty hunter who hunts bail skips with a one-seater, but we'll see how he handles it. I also liked what I identified as nods to the Fast and Furious franchise, specifically the first one, may that be what they went for or not. So yeah, this is it. I just had to make this cause I simply loved the episode. Let me know what you thought about it, what I missed or got wrong. Watch my breakdown of the Star Wars Eclipse trailer and Dynamo Dream by Ian Hubert. Links are in the description down below. If you enjoyed watching, it's not too late for you. You can still join the like side. And if you want to see more like this, consider subscribing, which helps me out a lot as a new channel. Now, goodbye and take care, my friends, or as the Ishi tip should have said to Mando, Mi chusku anchesku, mapatesa.